Hi there, it's Ben Housel here, and in this class we're going to have a look at how we make this looping animated GIF in Photoshop. We're going to go right through from all the steps, including making the vector shapes, warping the vector shapes, and then outputting and exporting that image as an animated GIF. So jump on in, this is a fun class, it's pretty quick to do, it's not very technically difficult, and you'll end up with a great result that you can upload to Twitter, to Facebook, and jump in, we'll get started, and let's have some fun. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do here in Photoshop is create a new project. So we're going to go to File, New, and whichever version of Photoshop you're in, the settings that we're going to be working with are the same. The layout of the new document window will be slightly different. We're going to be working in pixels because we're working for screen, and we're going to work at 1920 by 1080. And that just means that we can export this out as an HD video loop if we want to. The resolution, when we're working for screen, doesn't really matter. We can change it to 72 pixels per inch, but it's really the pixel dimensions that matter here. The resolution is only something you need to be concerned about if you're working for print. We're going to stick with RGB and 8-bit color, and we're going to leave the background as white. We don't need to worry about any advanced options here. So let's click Create, and straight away we're going to go and save this. So we'll go to File, Save As, and we're going to drop this right onto the desktop, and we'll call this Spiral Loop. So the first step here is to create our spiral loop, and what we're going to use to do that first of all is the pen tool in Photoshop. So when we're creating shapes with the pen tool, we want to think about a couple of things. The first is to check that we're using the shape option up here in our options toolbar, that we have a fill with a color in it. Now the way that we're working means that we can change the color a little bit later on. So I'm just going to pick a nice orange here for the moment. We don't need a stroke for our shape, and everything else we can leave as is. Now, when we're creating our spiral, we want to make sure that it's spiraling around the center point here. So I'm going to turn on my rulers, so Command and R, or View and check the rulers option. And then we're going to drag down a ruler, and as you get close to the center, you'll feel that ruler snap to the middle. So I'm going to drag a horizontal and a vertical ruler across and just check they're snapping to the middle. So now what we want to do is make a shape that is the longest it's going to be when we create our spiral, and that will become apparent a little bit later on. So if you just follow along with these steps, we're going to click in the middle once here, out towards the edge here, once, twice, and then back to the center point here. Now, if you've made your triangle shape a little bit too wide there, you can come to the direct selection tool and select these points and pull them in a little bit. So once we have our first shape here, we're going to jump back to the Move tool up here. We're going to make a duplicate of that shape, okay? But we're going to duplicate it and rotate it at the same time. So I'm just going to deselect and reselect my layer, and then hold down Command and tap T, and that will bring up the Move options. And now I'm going to pull this anchor point in the middle down to the center of my canvas. And that means that when I rotate now, it's going to rotate around that point. And then I'm going to hit Command and tap T to transform this. And what I want to do is transform this. And what I want to do when I transform this is make sure that I've got a nice gap between this triangle and the next triangle. So we want it to kind of flow down to around about here. So to be a bit more accurate with that, I'm just going to duplicate this layer by dragging it down to the new layer button on the bottom right there. And then I'm going to use this as my first transformation. So I'm going to select my second layer there and do Command and T, and then just pull my anchor point down to the center of my canvas and just rotate this until I touch the edge of that first shape there. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my first shape and do Command and T and do the same, except this time I'm going to make sure that I come right to the bottom of that second shape. Now once I've done that, I'm going to delete that second or topmost layer that I've got here currently. Now if I hold down Shift, Alt, Command and tap T, I'm going to get that rotation with a nice gap in the middle, and you can see it moving round nicely there. And as we come back round to the beginning, we should hopefully end up with a nice evenly spaced shape splaying out. Now this is a nice design in itself, it's a useful technique to know, but we're going to take this a few steps further and make this into an animation. So the first thing we're going to do is select all of our layers. So I've got my topmost layer selected here. I'm going to hold down Shift and select the bottommost layer. And once I've got all these layers selected, I'm going to blend these layers together. So I'm going to merge these shapes, and then I'm going to right click on that layer and rasterize this layer. Okay, now what I want to do is take this layer and distort it. So we're going to use the swirl tool to do this. So we're going to go to filter, distort, and twirl. And now we can see that we get this nice twirl of that shape. So we can have it twirling a little bit or a lot. I think we're going to go for around minus 180 degrees for this twirl. Okay, we get a preview of it here, and then we click OK. We have a nice twirl there. And if we do Command and T, you can see that because we set our initial shape to be larger than the canvas here, we haven't got any edges showing here of the ends of those shapes. So we've got a nice shape that we can now swirl here, and that will rotate without cutting off any of these corners or any of these edges. So now the next step is to duplicate this layer with a transformation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to add 3 guides here. Okay, and I'm going to use that as a guide for my transformation. So I want to transform this so it's swirling, but a little bit at a time, so we get a little bit of that sense of motion. So if I hold down Command and tap T now, and then just move that until I touch that first line, and hit Enter here, and actually I didn't need this second line here, that's enough transformation. Then I can do the same again, so I'm holding down Shift, Alt, Command, and T, and I'm duplicating these layers. So I'm just going to duplicate this 4 or 5 times. Okay, and the loop will be quite quick because essentially we have a series of layers here that will match up quite quickly. So we'll move from one layer to the next, and so on and so forth, and we'll get back to the beginning point where this first layer is touching that line roughly. So as soon as we get back to this point where we're touching that line, we've got a loop. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers, and that should be good for a loop here. Now what we need to do is turn on our timeline to create that animation, and we're going to use the slightly older school method of making our animation here just by turning on and turning off the layers in Photoshop. So it's not a timeline as you can use in Photoshop, it's just a frame by frame animation, which is the old school way of making animated GIFs. So in here we have our option to create a video timeline, but once we create that, we're going to jump down to the bottom left here. So we're going to click create video timeline, and then we're going to jump down to the bottom left, and we're going to go to this timeline where we just have individual frames. Okay, so each frame we're going to get to last for 0.1 seconds. So basically 1/10 of a second. And then once we've done that, in our first frame here, we're going to turn off the top layers that we have here. Then we're going to create a new frame, turn off the bottom layer, turn on the next layer. And if we move between these now, you can see we're starting to get that animation. So we'll create the third frame, turn on the third layer here, and keep moving through until we get all these layers nicely looping. So now if we change this from once to forever and press play, we should have a nicely looping animation. Okay. And so now we have a quick loop, and what you'll notice is there's a little bit of a jump in here, and that's really to do with the accuracy of the angles at which we've created our rotation in the first instance. So with a little bit more planning and experimentation, we could get these a little more evenly spaced so that we don't have this little jump here. And now because we're working with layers, we can use some hue, saturation, adjustment layers to actually manage our color here. So if we go to the background layer in the first instance and do Shift F5 and fill this with 50% gray, and then add a hue, saturation, adjustment layer above that, we can now colorize that, so we can end up with a color that kind of nicely offsets against the orange. If we select all of our layers here and right click and create a new group from those layers, the animation will still work even though those layers are grouped. This allows us to make a new hue, saturation, adjustment layer, and to right click and create a clipping mask so that that is only applying to the topmost layers. So you can see we've got independent color adjustment that we can do with that foreground and background layer. So we can create any color that we want in the background and without having to manually recolor or remake what we've done. So now we're going to run through how to export this as an animated GIF and as a movie. So firstly, we'll have a look at the animated GIF option. So if we go to File, Export, I'm working in a newer version of Photoshop. So the Save for Web option that I'm looking for is under this Save for Web Legacy option. You might see Save for Web in the main menu next to Export. If you're using an older version of Photoshop, they're exactly the same thing. And we're going to jump into this Save for Web Legacy version. I'm going to click on this. And once we're in here, we have our animation set up. So as soon as we change this from JPEG to any one of the GIF options, the animation will play back and it will give us the option to export it as an animated GIF. So I'm going to select GIF 128 dithered. Okay. And for these flat colors, an animated GIF will export out a really nice high quality version of this loop. I'm going to drop down the size of this. So I'm going to change this to about 40% of the original size, just so it's a little bit smaller for the web. We can see a preview of the file size down here at the bottom left. We've got the same options that we set up in Photoshop, so it's going to loop forever. So if we play this back now, we can see a preview of what that's going to look like. And so now we can go ahead and export this out. So I'm going to click Save, jump to my desktop, and then save this out as Spiral Loop GIF. So now if we upload this to any one of our social media platforms, we'll have a looping animated GIF. Now, before we export out the movie, we need to think about how this is going to loop because it's very, very short. So if we go to File, Export, and Render Video. So in this export option, we're going to have a very, very short movie to export. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can lengthen this. One would be to export out a movie and then re-import that into a video editor and then loop it in that video editor. The other will be to loop this on a timeline, so copy and paste these frames so that we're playing them back more than once. So I'm just going to cancel this, jump back to my frames here, and I'm holding down Shift to select them all. And then if I drag them to the new layer, you can see it's duplicating those. So if I just keep duplicating that loop, so each frame is running at 0.1 seconds. So if I want, say, 5-10 seconds of this, then I would need 10 times 5 or 10 seconds. So I'd need somewhere close to 100 frames. So I'm going to keep duplicating this until I get over 100 frames. And we're at the end here, we're at 64. I'll scroll back to the beginning here, hold down Shift and select again and duplicate, and we'll do it one more time. So we're going to end up with over 200 frames, but you can see by selecting everything and then duplicating it, we quite quickly and exponentially end up with a few frames. So I'm going to loop this once now so we can see how long it's going to be. So if I come back to frame number 1 and play this through, you can see we're getting a few seconds of loop here. Okay, so let's go and export this out. So if we go to File, Export, Render Video, and then we're going to export out all frames. We'll keep it as this 1080p format, running at the document frame rate, and we'll render this to the desktop. We could select a different folder if we wanted to, hit render, and now we're exporting out our movie. So once that's done, let's just have a little peek at what we have. So jump back down to the desktop, holding Command and Tab to move between my applications and Shift Command D to bring up the desktop. You can see we've got this spiral loop. We'll just play it through and you can see we've got a nice smooth, slightly hypnotic spiral loop that we've made with the tools in Photoshop. And we also have our animated GIF here as well, a smaller version of that same loop. So that's everything that we're covering in this class. I hope it's been useful and I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. Go ahead, I'd love to see some of your class projects, embedded GIFs on the course project board, and go ahead and have some fun.